Lombardy. All right, got it. I got it. I got it. Okay. Um, and I want to say this is that he has volunteered to speak on this very current topic, which brings out the point I've made many times is that the influence of World War One persists for probably many years, maybe even many centuries. But the current war that's going on between Russia and the Ukraine is an example of that. You know, we've always been in the last, say, 25 years concerned with the Middle East, but this is much closer to Europe, and it's part of that same picture. So World War One is a global influence. So I'd like to turn this over to Dana, and let's see how he connects both that, what he calls seminal effect of World War One to our current time, especially with now the Ukraine. Dana, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sal. I'm happy to do this, and I've been following the war for the past 6+ months as it unfolded, and back in February of this year. And I have been trying to keep track of things that have been happening. And there are several really interesting and unusual things about this war that are unlike any war that we've had in the past. We probably have heard about the fact that Vietnam was considered the first televised war, where you literally had journalists and people on the ground who were reporting about what was happening in Vietnam. We didn't necessarily get real-time, instantaneous images from Vietnam, but we got reports on evening television in the United States, and we could see what had happened that day or over the past week. This war in Ukraine is unlike any war that's ever been fought, because we have real-time uploaded videos from hundreds of people who have their cameras on their phones and are able to share this information with people, like I said, instantaneously through Elon Musk's Skylink satellites that continue to provide Ukraine with cell phone coverage. And that means that even somebody that I know who's fighting in Ukraine has been able to post after they get out of the front line, and have been able to basically call back to the people they know and share what's happened. And there's so much of this that it's stunning. In fact, there's so much information coming in over cell phones and from the people who are in Ukraine, whether they're civilians, military, both sides simultaneously. And then you have all the people who are reporting on it, who are YouTube experts or other types of channels on the internet that are talking about what their evaluation is, what their analysis is, what they speculate. So we end up with a huge amount of information, and I've been trying to keep it sort of straight and sort it out for myself to understand what's been happening. So what led to this particular talk was the fact that there were certain parallels that I found with this current war, despite the technological differences that make this war really a chain of events since World War I, and I'll show you in this presentation. Hang on. There we go. So on the far left, that is a Google map, and Google, it's an open source. It's not classified. It's not top secret. You can literally look at what's going on in Ukraine from satellites that are circling the planet, and you can see the trench lines, and obviously it looks very similar because trenches are trenches, and there's a reason for the pattern that you see, in order that one explosion that hits, say, a section of a trench doesn't kill everybody in the trench. That's why all those little zigzags are there. Next to it, you can see World War II, and there was trench work there as well. This is Stalingrad, 1942, but it could be Kyiv or Kharkiv. It could be just as easily those places. And if you didn't have the label, you would not necessarily know. And of course, on the far right, we've got the Western Front 1917. You can see the elaborate amount of trenches because they were locked into a certain location for months, in some cases years, and they were able to continue to develop the trenches, the sophistication, the multiple lines of trenches that led up to the front or back to the rear areas where supplies, ammunition, and reserves were kept. The war in Ukraine does not have the kind of elaborate trench works and trench system that you see in World War I, but it's still there. It is, and why is that? Why are we still seeing trenches so many years, over 100 years later? Well, keep your head down, keep your head down, keep your head down. On the far right, you see World War I. In the middle, you see Tobruk, 1942, and then you see Ukraine on the far left. The only difference is that are the soldiers and what they're wearing, because weapons became so lethal and there were so many bullets and artillery rounds being fired from World War I through World War II and today, that the only great protection you've got is to have as much dirt as you can between you and the bullets and the explosions. And that's why trenches continue to dominate certain areas of the wars that we see. Now, in World War II, there was a lot more mobility, but I'll get into that in a moment, because Ukraine also has a lot of mobility, despite the fact that there's still trenches that lock the lines and provides security and safety for the troops when they're not moving around. So you can see, keep your head down, keep your head down, keep your head down. I thought it was an interesting little group of pictures. You can see the guy on the far right has a periscope looking over the trenches. You're not going to stick his head up because that'll get you killed. And World War II, there's a guy on East Front doing the same thing, and Ukraine 2022. The binoculars, these periscopes are much more sophisticated, but it's still the same thing. Don't stick your head up, otherwise you'll get killed. And of course, artillery has inflicted the most casualties from World War I through World War II. And guess what? It continues to inflict the most casualties in Ukraine. The weapons themselves are much more sophisticated. They're much more technologically advanced. World War II was the first time that you saw massive guns able to fire shells that weighed as much as a man, in some cases as much as a car, into the enemy's area. But they were dumb shells. They were dumb bombs dropped from planes. They had no guidance whatsoever. You just threw them out there and hoped they hit something and killed or wounded enough of the enemy to allow your troops to move forward. Although in World War II, you can see the guys operating the cannon in the middle. World War II, there was a lot more sophisticated targeting systems used that made them more accurate. So they didn't have to throw out as many shells at a target. For example, World War I, 1916, the first day of the Somme was following up on a week-long bombardment. This is just the British. 1.7 million artillery rounds were fired on the German lines, and most of them didn't do anything. 20% of them were duds. A lot of them just hit around the area, and the Germans, there were casualties caused. Concussion was obviously a big part of it, but the number of rounds fired for the amount of damage done would prove to be much less than what the British had hoped. In World War II, they got much better at targeting, and so they were able to do fire a few rounds for the impact area and then adjust the fire so that they could fire then a whole bombardment, and they didn't need 1 million rounds. They could do serious damage with just, say, 12 cannon firing, maybe 100 rounds between them, and achieve that. Now we have a situation where one cannon fires one round, and that's all they need because of the targeting capability of what is, we call it GPS, which is basically a geographic positioning system, and you can literally find the exact coordinates on the planet, and you can target that or rather you can program that into the artillery shell, and it just fire it up in the air and it's going to land exactly where you want it to land. So if it's got to go through a certain window in a certain building, it's going to happen. This is a game changer, and it also is radically different from past wars, but it also is very similar in that artillery is still vitally important and is still the big killer on the battlefield. We just don't need as much of it. And they're smart artillery shells, they're smart bombs that are able to do this damage. So guess what? Here's something that even precedes World War I: body armor, which, you know, the knights in armor of Middle Ages, ancient Rome, ancient Greece. Armor on a person helps protect the soldiers. It always has. And if you had more sophisticated armor, then you were able to protect your men better. Almost everybody in ancient societies that were regular soldiers had some kind of armor and or shield to protect them. Otherwise, you didn't last very long on the battlefield. In World War I, not as much body armor was used, although in several cases, like this person, this German stormtrooper, it was to protect him so he could reach the enemy trench line and throw his grenades into the enemy trench. He wasn't worried about carrying a rifle. He was just going to throw explosives into the trench and suppress or kill the enemy that he was attacking. But they didn't have enough armor, and it was too expensive to try and outfit millions of men, literally, in World War I, who could have used armor, but they just could not provide enough of it. So the body armor in the past sort of faded away until World War I, and it wasn't used much in World War II, except for what were called flak jackets, because the men in the airplanes who flew over Germany, they had so much flak artillery shells fired at aircraft that threw out basically lots of shrapnel, and the men were not protected. They had no armor. They had what clothing they were wearing, and that was it. So they developed flak jackets late in the war that were supposed to protect them. Didn't really work that well, and a lot of guys decided if they were going to protect anything, they took it off and sat on it, so that they ended up not having their genitals blown off. But all of a sudden, we've gone back to, here comes the big circle, body armor, a massive amount of body armor. There's good body armor, like the guy on the left is wearing, and good, you can see that not only does he have a chest protector and a neck protector, and the body armor is on the back and it wraps around his sides, as you can see, and he's also, again, worried about protecting his genital area, which is just something, I guess, unique to guys that they, you know, whether it works or not, who knows, but it makes them feel better. Not all the body armor is that great. So on the right, we see somebody that means well, and it's like, here, I guess it's better than nothing, but this is not the greatest body armor you've got. And the fact is, they're wearing whatever they can. On the Russian side, the special forces, Spetsnaz and paratroopers and others wear body armor. It's part of their equipment. The Wagner group, which is a group of mercenaries, they have body armor. But you know what? Most of the Russian soldiers do not have any body armor at all. And this has been a really big problem because they've taken massive casualties because of this. Well, again, like I said, the artillery is the big killer. And if you're inside the first 15 meters of an explosion from one of these big artillery rounds or missiles, you're probably going to be concussed to death. A concussion will kill you. Even if there's not a scratch on your body, it'll just make your insides jelly. If you're beyond that, about 30 meters, there's shrapnel that you have to contend with, which is why this body armor can be helpful. May not prevent you from getting wounded, but it could prevent you from being killed. And also the body armor, in theory, Kevlar or ceramic, basically inserts, or even steel inserts in those uniforms, those basic body armor suits. Those things can stop bullets as long as the bullet isn't a really big bullet that will take out people. So body armor is one of the oldest forms of protection for soldiers, and it's still being used today, but not everybody has it. And a lot of the new guys who are being drafted into both armies definitely are not going to have this, and they may not last long on the battlefield. So what kind of weapons are being used? Well, tanks, which started in World War One, this is another parallel we've got with World War One, became much more important on the battlefield in World War II, more sophisticated, faster, and were able to go farther and cause lots of breakthroughs. And then in Ukraine, both sides at least started with the same tanks. In this case, you can see those are T-72 Russian tanks. Remember that Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union. So its army was trained the Soviet way, had the same kind of tactics, same kind of doctrine, and same kind of weapons. So you can use each side's captured vehicles, you can use each side's captured weapons, and you can see that they are covered in boxes. I don't know if you can see that on the turret on the right, and you can see the boxes on the front of the tank on the left. What are those? Okay, so tanks have armor, just thick armor that's supposed to protect them. But the weapons that are being fired against these tanks can destroy them if they're hit in a certain place, in a certain location. And so those boxes contain what is called reactive armor. It's literally explosives. Every one of those little boxes has explosives in it. And same thing on the turret on the Russian tank on the right. So what does that mean? It means that when a shell, a missile, or whatever hits the tank at that point, before it reaches the armor, before it can penetrate the armor and wound or kill the crew inside, that armor, that reactive armor, which is explosives, is supposed to go off and destroy, by using its explosive force, the artillery shell being fired at it or the missile that's coming in at it. That's the theory. I'll get into a little bit later and tell you what is really happening on the battlefield, but you can see that both sides are using the same tanks. They're also using the same type of armored personnel carriers, the same thing. Both sides are equipped with, although the Ukrainians now are getting more armored personnel carriers from the United States and Australia and other places that are not Soviet, and they're much better made, and they're much more protection. Although these guys they certainly don't seem to care about the protection right now. That's because, number one, they're behind the lines trying to move up to the front. Now, why don't they just ride inside? Well, because number one, they can't all fit inside. Number two, it's really hot. This stuff went over the summer, and they're already roasting, and inside those vehicles it gets even worse. So it's much better to be on the outside of a tank or an armored personnel carrier than to be inside. Like I said, they started off with the same equipment, but the Ukrainians are now getting better equipment and more equipment from the West. So one of the things people said is the tank dead? Oh my God, look at how many vehicles. And then when they said tank, they also meant the armored personnel carriers. And you can see on the far left, that tank exploded literally from the inside. It blew its turret off, and they have a serious design flaw. And then in the middle, you can see that there's an armored personnel carrier that's completely burned out. So, are these armored vehicles really useful, or are they just mobile armored coffins? And what's doing them in? There are a whole bunch of what's called portable anti-tank weapons. And you can see the guy sitting over there. It's a one-shot. Bang, he just pulls the trigger, aims it at what the vehicle is, and in theory it will go and strike the enemy at that point. The vehicle, because it's a guided missile, and it can hit, there are also unguided missiles that are used on the rocket propelled grenades, the RPGs, that don't have that guidance, but this one's more sophisticated and has a guidance that can hit a vehicle. And again, when it hits one of those vehicles, you can see the result on the left. That's what happens to them and the guys inside. There have been nearly 3,000 Russian tanks and APCs on the Russian side that have been destroyed in this weapon in this past 6 months. This is an enormous number of tanks and vehicles that have been destroyed. Russia has thousands more, so they're just going to burn through them. And I mentioned the design flaw. The tanks are back in the Cold War era. They have T-62s even out there, and the 62 means the year it was introduced. They have T-72s, which are the primary tank. Again, 1972 during the Cold War. They have a 1980 or T-80 tank that the Russians introduced, which was the latest one they had before the Soviet Union collapsed. And then they have a T-90 that they're trying to introduce, but there are very low numbers on it. Tanks are extremely expensive to create and maintain. And the Russians already have thousands of T-62s, T-72s, T-80s, and so forth. So they're just going to burn through those, literally burn through them, while they keep their forces, supplied with armored vehicles. But this comes down to, okay, but are they that vulnerable? And what's the flaw in the Russian tanks? So you have to store the ammunition somewhere. And so in a Russian tank, in these designs, it's stored in the floor, underneath the guys who are walking around, trying to maintain and drive the tank and reload the gun, and the commander's up in the turret trying to look at where they're going and give commands to the other guys. And they're all walking on the ammunition, literally walking on the ammunition that's right underneath them that has no armor protection. That means that if something explodes in the tank, even a small penetration, there's a really good chance that that ammunition is going to go off. There is one spectacular video that shows a turret on a Russian tank being thrown hundreds of feet into the air as the ammunition inside detonates. And these spectacular explosions are simply because, even like I said, a small penetration that might not normally knock out, say, an Abrams US Army tank or a West European tank. It's pretty awful what happens to the Russians. It's like they don't really build them for long-term use. And this goes all the way back to their design philosophy in World War II. It's the same, we've got plenty of them and we got plenty of people. So if it doesn't last that long, all it has to do is last long enough. But again, the tank is not dead, even despite the fact that if you listen to TV, standard news, they have all these pundits and experts. They're saying, "Oh, the tank is dead. The tank is dead." No, it's not, because the Ukrainian army's recent offensives proves this. They are spearheading the attack in the areas that Ukraine is recapturing, and you can see the tanks on the left and the guys on the right are riding again on top of their armored personnel carrier. Again, it's like, okay, they may not be in the very front line, but you can still get hit by artillery and drones behind the lines. So this just tells you either they are super confident or they're not getting a lot of counter battery fire at them. The Ukrainians now have changed the insignia on their tanks. So see the white cross, they're using white crosses, whereas the Russians are using the Z, the Z. The Z is the insignia you see on a lot of Russian vehicles to distinguish their vehicles as the invading force. And the Ukrainians, if they can, they put a white cross on their vehicles, or they just simply fly a Ukrainian flag, which you see on the left. So no, the tank is not dead, is not going to be dead, because all of the land that the Ukrainians are quickly taking back in the past month, they have taken more territory than the Russians did in 6 months. And so this just is, no, it's like you have to use your tanks wisely. You have to have good tanks, and you also have to have tactics that protect the tanks. And in the past, the reason you had so many Russian tanks that are being destroyed, and you can see this in videos, literally watch them, there'll be a Russian tank all by itself just sort of running around inside a town. It's like, this is really stupid. You do not have unsupported vehicles, unsupported tanks, or unsupported infantry just running around trying to do things. And yet this has been an amazing, revelation on what the Russian army is really like. Before this war happened, the Russian army was considered to be by many so-called experts as the second most effective army and the second best army on the planet after the United States Army. They were just heralded. It's like we were buying all kinds of equipment because, oh my God, look at the threat that the Russians are. Now, the Russians are the second best army in Ukraine, which means that, the Russian bear is not really as much of a threat as people thought about it. These kinds of losses in not only equipment, but in human beings is just proving it that the Russians do not have a good army. I'll get into that now in a few minutes about why that is, but let's continue here. Now, what's different about the war in Ukraine? Okay, so some things have been game changers, and one of that is drones everywhere. I don't put up a picture of the famous Turkish Bakhtar drone, which is huge, it's as big as a man, and the one on the right is a tiny drone, but they all have the same capability. They can locate with GPS where ammunition supplies are, Russian headquarters are, or whatever it is, your bridges, and you can hit them literally with an artillery shell if you get the GPS coordinate for that, or for your missile, or for a bomb dropped from an airplane. This has been huge, and you're going to see a lot more of these. These have taken over the intelligence gathering on the battlefield because it is so dangerous for aircraft to fly. Because remember the anti-tank weapon I showed you? Well, there are also thousands of single shot man-carried anti-aircraft missiles that are out there all over the battlefield. And so the airplanes are staying away. Neither side has air control, unlike the United States and Iraq and Afghanistan that had total command and control of the air and could go fly and drop bombs with their and missiles with their helicopters, with their aircraft, and so forth. The Russians have far more aircraft, but they stay far away from the potential of getting shot at by the Ukrainians, and they send their missiles from aircraft from the Russian side of the border. And a lot of them are just dumb missiles and dumb bombs that don't reach an exact coordinate, but then they don't care if they're just hitting a city or a town. They hope it's close enough and they kill enough, soldiers. Whether they kill also civilians is immaterial to the Russians. So onward we go. Now these is just weird. I mean, think about this for a second. Remember, the civilians have not all been evacuated. There's a lot of civilians who have been overrun by the Russians, and now they're being overrun by the Ukrainians. So the people in the town, they hide in their basements, they hide in their houses as the war is being fought outside. And then they come outside and said, "Hey kids, why don't you climb up on the tank and have your picture taken?" Or wait, I've got my selfie. I'm going to take a selfie of me. Send it back to my buds because I'm a soldier and this is really cool looking. This is like pretty amazing. Because this is unlike Vietnam. It's unlike any war that's ever happened in the past. And it's all happening in real time. And in civil wars where you had like in Beirut or Syria or Yemen and other places like that, people don't come out and do this because they don't have as many cell phones, and in case they can't even post it. This is Elon Musk is making this happen with his geosynchronous satellites on Skylink that are giving these people access to the internet and access to be able to post this stuff everywhere. There's a bad thing that's happened with soldiers doing this, because if they're doing this when they get back to the rear area, they where they may have a little bit more security, but when they're in the front line doing this, the Russians are able to figure out where they are, and they can target their GPS artillery and their missiles. And this guy is like risking his life by doing this. And this is quite a few of the soldiers on both sides have been targeted because they're giving away their position with that phone. I certainly hope that woman didn't end up getting something dropped in on her, but this is right in the middle of a war. This is just incredible. Okay, so what happened? The Russian invasion happened on February 24th of 2022, but there's a background to this. What happened in February of this year was a continuation of the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine that began in 2014 when separatists in the Donbas area and the on the far on this map above, you can see the red area on the far right. That's the Donbas. And those states, those oblasts, are the areas where there are a lot of Russian speaking and Russian ethnic groups live there. And so they basically declared their independence from Ukraine. And then shortly thereafter, Russia invaded and took control of Crimea, which is the striped area at the very bottom of the map. Crimea sticks out into the Black Sea, but then the Russians invaded the areas you see. So that went on for 6 months. And then on September 6th, the Ukrainians surprised everybody and counterattacked in the north and the south. The Russian army up to that point held the initiative for 6 months, even though Ukraine's defense efforts forced them to redirect their efforts to the south and east. So I'm going to go back just for a second. You can see at the top north of the map, the one on the far left is going to Kyiv, which is the capital of Ukraine, but it got stopped. And then the one over to the right, but for a little bit further right, the third arrow over to the right is going to Kharkiv, which is a major city in that portion of Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians were able to take that back because the Russians abandoned and threw everything in they had on these areas you see that are the oblasts, the provinces or states of the Donbas area. And the Ukrainians counterattacked, and basically in 1 month, okay, what you see the Russians have took 6 months. The Ukrainians counterattacked and took the area you see there much faster than the Russians, and they did it with their armored columns, and they did it with their tanks and armored personnel carriers, which is much closer and much more like World War II type advances of 10, 20 kilometers over several days. Whereas the Russians, and you can see that the Russians are still trying to get some more territory in the center. You can see the striped area. I don't know if you can see my my arrow, my browser arrow.
Yeah, we see it, Dana.
Okay, good. Anyway, so you can see that these tiny increments, this makes no sense. The Ukrainians are scratching their head. Everybody is going, why are the Russians doing this? The danger is here. They lost all this, and these guys are continuing to push. The danger is here. These Russians are isolated. The river here, all the bridges have been knocked down. These guys are trapped. And this is a much greater disaster in the making, and yet they're pushing here. And the reason, this is all speculation, the reason is that this area is where the Wagner Group, and the Wagner Group, as I mentioned earlier, they are basically mercenaries. They're former military trained soldiers who now are in a for-profit organization, and they get paid to capture territory. So they can keep doing what you see there because they're getting paid for everything. They get bonuses for capturing another half kilometer, maybe another kilometer. And it's like, this is just goofy. You know, I mean, it makes sense to them because they're getting paid more money to do this. And that's why they're fighting. But the danger is up here. The danger is down here. And the Russian army has an entire force sort of doing their own thing right in the middle. And it's keeping more Ukrainian forces tied down because they can't ignore this. They have to protect it. But they're basically have pulled off an incredible diversion that was not expected. Initially, before the September 6th offensive happened, the Ukrainians were talking about, we're going to retake Kherson as a big city right down here. And the reason this is so important is because the water that comes through, as you can see this, that's the Dnieper River and a huge reservoir, and there's water that comes down here to Crimea. Well, they chopped that off. They cut that all off. And so Crimea doesn't have any fresh water. They don't have anything in there. And all of these are basically not, this nasty water they don't want to drink. And so that's one of the reasons they crossed the river and captured this, is so they could Kherson and have control of the river. Well, now the bridges are gone, and the Ukrainians said, we're going to retake this, which meant that all the reserves that the Russians had up here were moved down to this area to protect against the Ukrainian expected offensive down here. And instead, guess what? This all was Russian territory up here. This is where the Ukrainians actually attacked. This is where their main force came. And in less than a month, 1 month, they recaptured all of this territory, and they're still pushing. We don't know where they're going to end up, because that river line has already been breached, and there's a tiny, I think another river line has been breached. So there's like nothing to stop them. And if you see these lines right here, these are main roads going into Russia, and that's what those are, supply lines. If the Ukrainians capture this crossroads and this one, which I think they have now, and there's a rail line that comes down here, these guys aren't going to get supplies. They can get some this direction, but most of it's coming down from this direction. So now they don't have supplies, and there's only one bridge across the Crimea into Crimea for Russia, and everything comes up to here through here. So this is really a disaster. This is ridiculous. This is a disaster, and this is a disaster in the making, because all these Russians in here, they're basically prisoners. They can get no more tanks. They can get no more armored personnel carriers. They're limited how much ammunition they can get, and they can't fly it in because the anti-aircraft individual one-shot anti-aircraft weapons that are available to the Ukrainians will knock all that down, whether it's day or night. They can see at night. They have infrared and night vision goggles that allow them to do 24/7 accurate warfare. And so this is what the situation is right now, as of today. Where it's going to go, we don't know, but we know that because of this, three things happen. Putin said that these are Russian territory now, that they had an election held, a referendum in each of those oblasts, and that the people voted to say, we want to be part of Russia. So this is no longer Ukraine, this is Russia. And so that's Russia is now protecting Russia. They're not protecting Ukrainian captured territory. This is Russia. That's a big deal, because Putin said, if we have to use nukes to protect Russian territory, we will do it. In the meantime, he also called up 300,000 reservists, in theory. A lot of those guys have never served in the military, and they're being theoretically trained to go in here. To give you an idea of what training is to have an effective soldier, in the United States Army, you have 18 months of training before you would be deployed in Iraq or Afghanistan. 18 months. And even when you get there, you're usually assigned to work with a unit that had been there in order for you to get used to that area, what the enemy does, and to be trained even further. So if you get 18 days of training in the Russian army, that's pretty good, which means they have basically guys who have 18 days or less that are being shoved into this this area that they're going to protect. And this is just amazing. I mean, they're basically, I had mentioned that there were protests against Putin by his soldiers and civilians who were trying to get in there. But before we go to that, I'd like to tell you about my friend's son. So my friend's son is a combat experienced Marine who did several tours in Afghanistan. That's him on the left. I will not tell you his name. He's holding a Czech weapon. He's got some body armor, as you see, and he is fighting for an international group, just like the international brigades during the Spanish Civil War. the Abraham Lincoln Brigade from the United States, and there were other brigades formed from other countries that went in to fight for the Republican government in Spain against the fascists, against the Phalangists and Franco. And so we have international units. The Mozart group is one of those. And the Wagner group is the Russians who are fighting, which are mercenaries. There's no doubt both guys are mercenary groups. They're fighting, although Mozart doesn't really get paid. That guy is getting food and he gets ammo and whatever else he can scrounge up, but he's not really taking home any money, whereas the Wagner group is getting lots of money that they are able to bank, assuming they survive, or maybe their family will end up with the money afterwards. There is a little joke here. So the Wagner group had been in business for years in Africa, in Syria, and other places around the globe fighting for Russia. And so why do they call it Mozart? Because the Russians have Wagner. So that's why they're the Mozart group. This is the most unusual war you have. I mean, this is like, I'm going to take selfies and I'm going to make a joke of, what the name of my group is compared to the other guys. So this is just nuts. But I'll tell you what he has been posting and what he's doing. They did get into Ukraine, but initially they were not trusted. His unit has several Marines and Navy SEALs. It has several British paras, and it has Norwegians, Estonians, Poles, and others who are not there officially, but on the part of their governments, just like the international brigades were not officially fighting for one side or the other in Spain. But the bottom line is it pretty much boiled down to all the guys in Mozart come from the West, and the Wagner are all Russians or Russian satellites like Chechens or Georgians or others. Anyway, so they get there, and I'm going to pardon my language, but what he described when he got there and had experienced firsthand what is going on in Ukraine, he described it as a shit show. Very simple, a shit show. It's so disorganized, and the people are so amateur and do not have the training that he went through. This guy had multiple tours in combat, and the things that he does automatically that are muscle memory type reaction to keep himself alive and his buddies alive is like, they don't even understand that. They hadn't even understand how to do basic tactics, fire and maneuver, and all that. And they would have recent civilians, guys who had no training at all, coming into the Ukrainian army who don't look like this. They've got T-shirts, maybe they've got some body armor on them, maybe they don't. And they would have you can see the blue armbands. That's all they've got to distinguish themselves from the other side, because everybody looks the same. So you got camouflage. This is ridiculous. You've got camouflage. You're supposed to disguise yourself and hide, but you need to also at the same time let the other side know and your own side know that you're on their side. So you have these blue armbands all over your body to stand out so that you don't get shot by your own people. So you want to hide and you don't want to hide. This is like, to me, it's just like so bizarre, but it's obviously necessary, and they're doing this. Anyway, so he has a specialty in terms of, he did signals intelligence. That's called SIG-INT, signals intelligence, which basically means that he is an expert at listening to enemy broadcasts and cell phones and radios, and he's able to also send out drones that identify exact locations. The picture on the right is an ammunition dump that one of his drones discovered. He did that. That literally is what he did. He sent over a drone that located precisely where the ammunition dump was, and they sent that information to a Ukrainian artillery unit, and a couple of rounds later, boom, there goes, that went away very quickly. The ammunition supplies were destroyed. That's really important for several reasons. Not only obviously did it kill Russians and destroy their ammunition, but it took weeks, maybe even months to build up that supply of ammunition in one spot. Now, that means that in order to protect it, you've got to have more ammunition spots. But if you do that, then you have to have more trucks and more ways of transporting it to the artillery and the frontline troops who need the ammunition or the artillery shells or the gasoline or the food or whatever it is they need. So the accuracy of these drones giving the target designation and the exact location, GPS, to an artillery unit or a missile ends up doing that. So nowhere is safe. Headquarters are being attacked. And the best thing you can do is you go silent. They do not talk to each other on their cell phones. In fact, when they're out in the field, they may not have any contact with anybody, because if you give your position away, the very next thing that's going to happen is some mortar shells or artillery shells or missiles are going to come down on your position. So you go out, you do your thing, and then you go back to your base, relax. He has R&R back in Poland, where he's got a girlfriend who washes his clothes and they get fed and take care of him and his needs. And then they go back out in the Mozart group after a rest and recuperation, R&R, and they go back into the front line. And that's been going on for several months now, which again, it's like surreal, because you can literally cross into an area. Unlike World War II, I mean, if you went back from North Africa, there was no place safe unless you went to a neutral country, and they didn't turn you. So if you were a soldier, you had to go to an area that, unless you went all the way back to the United States, somewhere like Chicago, there was no place safe. In Ukraine, if you're not in Ukraine, and if you're in Poland or Romania or somewhere, you can take a break, have a restful and safe R&R, and then go back out and basically kill and destroy more Russians. This is really bizarre. It is unlike any other war that was fought on this kind of level. Although Vietnam had that sort of thing, although they weren't safe. The soldiers in Vietnam had R&R areas, but their bases could be attacked. In Afghanistan, the bases were theoretically safe, but they'd go back in there and they were also attacked by mortars and munitions or snipers. But this guy is able to go to Poland and basically relax completely, rest himself, and then get back into the front line. The other thing that I wanted to say about this is that he had to prove to the Ukrainians he could be trusted. A lot of the initial wave of Western so-called soldiers, and a lot of them lied to go and fight in Ukraine, because the Ukrainians were not doing any kind of vetting. They weren't like doing background checks. If somebody showed up and said, hey, I'm a British soldier and I want to fight for Ukraine, at that point, they're so desperate for soldiers. It's like, okay, here, well, you go join that unit. And these guys were like civilians, and they'd take out their phones and they'd take pictures saying, hey, here I am in Ukraine, like they're on vacation. And the next thing you know, a Russian mortar round lands right near him, kills him. And the Ukrainians didn't care about him as much because he's an idiot. But the problem is that he usually got Ukrainians killed or wounded as well. So when our hero here got to Ukraine with the Mozart group, the Ukrainians are like, yeah, we don't know if we want to listen to you or even believe you. And so he had to go out on patrols like this, where he had to kill Russians. And at that point, the Ukrainians going, oh, okay, you're good. We believe you. And at that point, the Ukrainians would start believing him when he would send information back to an artillery unit nearby and give him the coordinates to do what you see on the right, which is the ammunition supplies destroyed. So we're getting updates from this guy through his father on a daily basis, telling us what's going on there. And there are also, I just want to add, there are actual live body cam and cell phone videos being shot by both sides that are being posted live on the internet, and you can go and watch them. If you are interested in any way that you would like to know where you can find out this stuff, let me put my, I'm going to see if I can put my, here, I'm going to put my email address in the chat box, and you can contact me after this is over, and I'll be happy to send you the links to being able to find these. Even if you don't have a YouTube account, it doesn't matter. If you have internet connection, you will get more interesting, in my opinion, news on not only Ukraine, but the rest of the world than what we ever get on the mainstream media in the United States. And I really enjoy what they've been able to provide us. And on to the last important slide. Oh, there it is. So what's going to happen in Ukraine next? Well, all these mobilized troops are, well, I'm being generous. These soldiers that Russia is now sending to fight in Ukraine, and they're not all going willingly, and they also know it could be death. And it's like, do they really going to fight hard for Ukraine? I mean, their country's not being invaded. A lot of them don't want to do that. And of course, will Putin decide to, you know what, it's now Russia, I will nuke, I will send a nuke or two, and everybody better know how serious I am. But there'll be tactical nukes. In other words, they're not going to be city busters where one nuke can destroy a city the size of Kyiv or Kharkiv. There'll be tactical nukes, which are pretty dangerous anyway, and will probably destroy everything in a couple of kilometer square area. But what's happening with the Russians is that the Ukrainians are really brilliant. They probably had the most brilliant social network campaign that I've ever seen. I mean, this is like professional level. They have a phone number that they broadcast to the Russians saying, hey, if you want to surrender, call this number and we will help you do it safely, and we'll hold on to you until the war is over, and then you get to go back. Or if you don't want to go back, we'll let you stay here, or maybe help you get to some other country, maybe in the West. How effective that is, how successful, who knows? But all of this is basically undermining Putin's attempt to, keep the territory that he's got. So how real is this nuclear threat? So I'm going to use an example from World War II or prior to World War II. Adolf Hitler basically was rebuilding his army, and he knew he could not compete immediately against France and Great Britain like he did in World War I. His army wasn't ready. So the first thing he took was Austria. They had an election and they wanted to rejoin Germany. And because they're German speaking and they're part of Germany originally way back when, even though the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was not Germany or Prussia, it didn't matter. And, France and Great Britain were like, no, we're not going to war because he took over Austria. We already know what war is like. World War I was a disaster. We're not doing it. So Hitler decides, okay, we want to get back a piece of Czechoslovakia where we have basically native Germans who were cut off from the homeland and were put into Czechoslovakia by the Versailles Treaty, the Sudetenland. And we just want that back. That's all we want to do. And if you don't do it, we're going to go to war. He did saber rattling, and Chamberlain went to meet with him, the Prime Minister of England, and was able to work out peace in their time. Yes, okay, we won't have a war, and we'll just give him this little piece of Czechoslovakia. And of course, after that, several months later, Hitler moved in the rest of Czechoslovakia with his army, and Great Britain and France did nothing. They didn't even threaten to go to war against Germany. Now Hitler's like, oh yeah, I can keep this up, until they finally decide they're going to do something. And of course, he invades Poland. And at that point, Great Britain and France have no choice, and they have to declare war. So is this the kind of thing, the situation that Putin is trying to pull off, where the Donbass, which was part of the Soviet Union, was not part of the Ukraine until Khrushchev made it part of the Ukraine? Are we going to say, no, it's not worth risking this war? No nukes. No, we can't do that. Let's give Putin that territory. And that's maybe what's going to work out. I don't know. I have no idea. But that apparently is the strategy. And there are people in the West who are screaming it's not worth it. Donbass isn't even really truly Ukrainian. Why are we going to risk nuclear war to do this? On the other hand, Putin could say, okay, we got Donbass, let's get the rest of Ukraine, we can just, or maybe we'll just go get Odessa. That's the only other valuable part of Ukraine right now that has access to the Black Sea and all of its, its grain, because Ukraine and Russia have massive amount of grain that they export. And maybe what happens is after Donbass, Russia decides to go, Putin decides to go for Odessa. At what point does somebody say no? At what point do you call his bluff? Or at what point do you go to war? This is the really serious stuff that people are trying to figure out. And also, even though people are saying it'll be a nuclear war, so what if Putin does nuke, a town or a supply area or a concentration of Ukrainian troops and tanks? We don't have to nuke them back. There's no requirement. There's nothing that says you have to send a nuke for a nuke. We could just increase the amount of conventional weapons massively that Ukraine is going to get, and it could continue to push the the Russian army out of the areas of Ukraine that it captured. Does that mean Putin is going to do more? And after Ukraine, if we give him everything he wants, so we'll give him Ukraine, give him the Odessa, give him the Donbass. Well, the Baltic states were all part of the Soviet Union, and Putin's already said he wants to rebuild the Soviet Empire. He wants that. So does that mean Finland is going to be next after the Baltic states? All of this stuff is really serious. I have no answers for you. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm just saying these are the things that people are worried about. This is what's being talked about, sometimes in spectacular, emotionally charged fashion on mainstream media. And even people who are trying to be reasonable are uncertain exactly. No one knows. Nobody knows what's going on. And with that, I thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.
All right, Dana, wonderful production. Excellent. You did a great deal of informing us. I just want to mention a point that when you say the Ukrainians were trained by the Russians, they had the Russian equipment, they had everything else. Go back in history in our American Revolution. The Americans were trained, who were military, by the British.
That's right.
They fought the British. They knew how the British fought.
Yes.
They had British weapons. They had the same thing. So in a sense, this is a parallel to that time, to this time. And I really appreciate you doing this. The other thing
Sorry, Sal, I'm just going to interrupt a second. Sorry, Sal. Dana, if you wouldn't mind unsharing the screen so that for the Q&A, if we could all, then everybody can see.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I don't want to leave the meeting. Where am I going to?
No, don't. You just unshare. Yep. Just unshare. I can help you out if you need it.
Unshare. I'm not seeing unshare.
Just go.
Oh, I see it. Never mind.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, there I am.
Okay. Super. So everyone,
right.
just a quick comment here. So if you want to see the whole group as a whole, you can just go. It depends a little bit on what device you're using and how big your screen is, but you should have a view option that is usually at the top right hand, everybody, and you can.
I've got that, and I see most people. A lot of people just have their names up without a picture of their of what they look like, which is okay.
Yeah, that's fine. So everyone, if you click on gallery view, you'll be able to see everybody. We do encourage you to turn on your video if you would like to do that.
If the buddy thing works,
you can just you can raise your hand, or you can just speak up, and we'll continue with the questions. Thanks. I just wanted to get that all set up.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Dana, Steve Miller.
Hello.
Amplify a couple things that you mentioned earlier. Soviet Union influence on Russian design and procurement of weaponry. Old Russian proverbs, better is the enemy of good enough, and if it doesn't work, hit it with a bigger hammer. Russians, back in the Soviet Union, they had this huge defense budget and virtually unlimited manpower, which a lot of that is now gone with the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Right.
But they built a lot of cheap, expendable weaponry. Tank last 2 days, that's fine. We got thousands more coming.
Yep.
5,000 casualties in that last attack. We got 10,000 more. So what?
Right.
And at 6'2", I am too tall to get into Russian armor. I have the contusions on my head to prove it. And just a totally different design procurement from the West, where we build an airplane or a tank to last 40, 50 years from the get-go, not just because we don't have anything better, but that's what we're going to use.
Right.
The other thing is their management situation. They're basically, as you point out, officers and conscripts, and there's no NCO cadre. So when the lieutenant gets knocked off in the attack, there's no sergeant there to lead the troops, and it's
Right.
just total chaos.
Right.
You combine that with the Soviet mentality of you can't make a decision because you might do something wrong and that's the end of you. So there's nobody to make decisions. There's a total lack of initiative, and things just fall apart once your leadership is gone.
That's right. Yeah, I want to add that part of that includes lack of individual initiative, encouraging that. Our Army has always encouraged individual initiative. That's part of the most important. I mean, that's why our sergeants get things done. This, the officers come in and say, hey, we want to take that hill. And then they get out of the way and let the sergeant figure out how they're going to do that.
Exactly.
Right?
The sergeant's the middle manager.
Exactly. The Russians don't have that. In fact, you probably have heard how many Russian generals and colonels have been killed because once those lieutenants and captains either prove that they're incompetent or can't do it, they send their generals and colonels to run units that are way below their billet, And so
Well, that
That
again
was-
goes back to the communist system. There's perfection and disaster, and there's nothing in between.
right.
So if you make a change and it's good, the general says, wait a minute, I was supposed to think of that. You just made me look stupid because
That's
I
right.
didn't think of it.
Yep.
And there's just no initiative. There's the chain of command is totally different from what we in the West are used to.
Yep.
And you have only perfection or disaster, and disaster could be a nuclear bomb went off, or there's a dandelion growing in the barracks. Chernobyl was a great example. I got radiated by Chernobyl. Nuclear explosion. You can't see, hear, feel, or smell radiation. It must be harmless. Let's go home and hope nobody notices.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That was my second point, Dana, that one of the highest casualty rate among the Russians is their officer class, in this war with the Ukrainians. Anyway, go on. You have a number of people who have questions. I think they want to.
Actually, I want to make one point that's really important to me. When I was looking at how the war has evolved, the Ukrainians have done an amazing job of improving their ability to fight, of improving, their tactics. And this has all been done in 6 months. They have unlearned everything the Soviets taught them. And they've been able to introduce a more sort of hybrid of their way of fighting with Western ideas. Some of them after 2014 and the loss of Crimea, they were brought to the United States and other parts of the world where they were trained in Western ways of doing things. And that has escalated. Now they're being trained in England, they're being trained in other countries, and they're a hybrid of Soviet way of doing things with Western tactics and the way of having individual initiative and more of a bottom-up way of fighting.
Well, this also goes back to the lessons that
Sorry, Steve, we have a couple other people who are waiting, so maybe let's let them get in and then you can
Okay.
come back. So somebody called, I don't know your name, you're identified as K iPad. You had a question earlier. Yeah. I think you need to unmute.
You're muted.
All right, thank you for dealing with the technologically challenged. Anybody have any feeling about, you look at the Poles and the Baltic states and the Czechs who've been just shit on by the Russians. You know, I see any escalation in this. I have a feeling that Poland's just itching to roll east. And the Baltic states too. Anybody got a sense of that? You know, we're talking, in my opinion, we're actually looking at the end of World War I finally. You know, we're going with the long century of 1919 to 2022 or whatever, instead of the old short century of, you know, the end of World War I to the fall of the Russian Empire. I see this as kind of Russia's last gasp to regain that empire. And I think the rest of these small little countries that have been picked on by the Russians are going to finally up and say, hey, we're done.
Well, that's
Anybody
certainly
got any thoughts, opinions on that?
well, that's certainly the way that Finland and Sweden were pushed into joining NATO. I mean, you know, and they want to, all those countries in Europe cannot stand up to Russia by themselves. Ukraine could not do it by themselves without the massive
Collectively, that's what
amount
I'm
of
saying.
equipment and everything, right?
Just in NATO, but I'm wondering, does anybody see a path that, say the Russians do drop a nuke and the Poles say this is enough, we're going to go help the Ukrainians finally, instead of killing them like we did after World War II to divide up the area, but we're going to go help them now to push the Russians back and finish them off.
I just don't see them doing it on their own. I think as part of NATO, either NATO decides to do it or they don't. I don't see Poland sending their tanks and troops into
Well, what
Ukraine
about the
on their own.
coalition, say Poland, the Baltic states, Czechs? Is NATO going to be able to hold up? And, you know, if a nuke is dropped and the US says, we're not going to do anything about this, do you think NATO will hold up, and or will there be a break of the old Eastern Bloc countries trying to defend their freedoms?
I have no idea. I have no idea what would happen if Putin actually sets off a nuke. I don't.
That's
I
a
mean,
big booger, right?
yeah. Well, I mean, we have choice. We have options. One is that we don't have to answer nuke for nuke. We don't have to. Okay.
I agree. But
And
you just
and we also, I mean, and also, you know, right now, Russia is in a position. Putin is in a personal position that and remember, we have to remember this, all these protests in Russia, all these people are leaving, trying to avoid their draft. It's not a democracy. Russia's never been a democracy. He doesn't have to worry about opinion polls. He doesn't have to worry about whether the people like him or not. I mean, he's a dictator. He's a totalitarian regime, and he can do just about what he wants. And here's the other thing, you know, as long as we're talking about this, we have no idea if there's somebody worse than Putin that will take over. I mean, Putin may be the best one we've got that we could actually negotiate with, because we have no idea what kind of guy is going to take his place if there's a coup.
Mark, thanks, Dana. Mark Perlman, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Well, maybe not something to add. First, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Did World War I have anything to do with the creation of or the viability of Ukraine?
Yeah.
I thought that, I just want to know if there's any connectivity or link. You know, obviously, World War I had an impact on all the empires, but, you know, and the Treaty of Versailles created Iraq as a country from the Ottoman Empire. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I just want to know if there's a link between World War I and Ukraine.
Yes. In fact, they tried to establish a Ukrainian state that got snuffed out and ended up part of Poland. So the answer to your question is yes, there's a direct link.
Okay, so it became part of Poland after World War I?
The majority of it, yeah. A great book. Timothy Snyder is kind of the expert on that field. I know all this crap because I took a grad class, and that's what we did: ethnicity in Eastern Europe, and watching how these people got moved back and forth. And it's a fascinating subject. Timothy Snyder is a good go-to though for expertise in Eastern Europe.
Yes.
Tim Mulligan, you look like you wanted to add to that as well.
Yes, in particular, there's from the Russian point of view, and of course we haven't gotten much from the Russian point of view in this, but from the Russian point of view, going back to 1918, excuse me, the establishment of the Ukraine is a completely artificial creation from their point of view, and it dates specifically back to 1918, when Austria-Hungary and especially Germany helped establish the quote Ukrainian state in 1918. This was part of a German plan. Poland, the recreation or restoration of Poland is part of the same foreign policy of Germany and Austria-Hungary in a desperate attempt to try to solve the crisis of World War I and hopefully do it on the Eastern Front. And the idea was you help create these states from which Russia has drawn some of its soldiery. You help dismantle the Russian frontier. You create client states. That was the German, especially the German and Austro-Hungarian point of view. Create client states that will be, quote, independent, but economically dependent on Germany and Austria-Hungary. And this would wall off Russia for the future, that you'd have a Ukraine, you'd have the Baltic states, or there was some debate about that within the Germans, but you'd have a system of states that would wall off Russia and be dependent on Germany, especially to a lesser extent Austria-Hungary. There is, by the way, a 4-volume set of documents published in Philadelphia on events in Ukraine. You can see it there. Published in Philadelphia. Events in Ukraine, 1914, 1922. The Austro-Hungarians were actually sponsoring a Ukrainian Liberation Front or committee, which was formed in Galicia. Galicia was the old Austro-Hungarian province that was the seat of Ukrainian nationalism. And that became the basis. It's that part of Galicia that becomes subsumed within Poland. And that takes place really because of at the end of World War I, the war between Russia and Poland that results in the borders that Poland establishes up to 1939, which is the basis for Stalin one reason for Stalin going in on a deal with Hitler in order to try to get back that part of Poland, which was Ukrainian. But the point of view, going back to what I started with, the Russians always viewed the Ukraine as a completely artificial creation from 1918. And even though there was the Peace of Brest-Litovsk that nominally settled the Eastern Front to the benefit of Germany and Austria-Hungary against Russia, nevertheless, the Russians, there was a Ukrainian Bolshevik who in July 30th, 1918, assassinates a German field marshal in Kiev, a man named Eichhorn, the only German field marshal of World War I to be killed, quote, in action. He's actually assassinated by a bomb by a Ukrainian Bolshevik in Kiev. So the Russian point of view is Ukraine, and any independent Ukraine is an artificial creation of the West, Germany being the immediate target, but now Germany not being so much a target, but the West. So to the Russian mentality, at least among the elite, not just Putin, but among many members of the Russian elite, Ukraine is not an independent state except as something propped up by the West.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tim, any other questions? And Steve, we'll get back to you.
Okay, real short.
If,
I was going to point out that the Russians seem to have forgotten the lessons they learned in Afghanistan. When they invaded Afghanistan, they would pick up a motorized rifle division and move it into Afghanistan total complete motorized rifle division, including anti-aircraft and anti-tank weaponry. Well, the Mujahideen didn't have any tanks or airplanes, but they captured the Russian stuff, and guess who they used it against? So the Russians kind of learned that just because the book says we need to do it this way, maybe we need to start deviating from the book a little bit. They seem to have lost those lessons. Dana, you got any verification or?
The only thing I can say about Russia overall is that I understand that they have a different perspective, absolutely. And they also have to be taken seriously in terms of their view. It's not for us to say, hey, you're wrong, and therefore we're just not going to listen to you. I think that we have to, let's put it this way. It's always better to talk than fight, okay? It's always better to talk than fight. And the bottom line here is, do we impose something on Ukraine because we can, and because we don't want it to get out of control? But the bottom line is that Russia has been, in my personal opinion, a paper bear for a long time. In World War II, and they've convinced themselves that they won World War II. I mean, just like we don't talk about much in our history books about what Russia did in World War II, they do the same thing. And that's natural for most, I mean, you could read lots of books on D-Day, then not even realize the Canadians and the British also invaded on the same day on June 6th that we did, okay? So this kind of, basically you're biased toward your country, your nationalism, and that happens with everybody. However, the Russians believe it so much that they did this single-handedly without any logistical support, without millions of trucks and jeeps, without all the aircraft, without all the tanks, without all the food. They didn't even produce their own food after 1941. All their areas were overrun by the Germans. We did that. We provided the helmets, the boots, the clothing, the aircraft, the fuel, aviation, the high octane aviation that they needed to run their airplanes. All that was provided to them, but you'll never hear that. And the problem is not that we need to get a pat on the back for what we did, because the Russians sacrificed in blood with their people at a 20-to-1 ratio against the Germans in World War II, just to throw them out and help defeat Germany. So I'm not sitting here saying we should get more credit for it. The problem is that the Russians believe their own press releases. They've been believing their own stuff. So, we're the bad guys, and we never help them. I had a class out here of kids that came from different countries, and I showed them pictures about World War II, and we were working on it. They were part of a class, and that class was supposed to help us create banners about World War II and our involvement. And I showed a picture of the American Volunteer Group, the AVG, the Flying Tigers in China, okay? This kid's mind was blown. He's a Chinese young person who had never been told this, that America actually fought with the Chinese against the Japanese in World War II, had no idea. And that's what the Russians are also facing. They have no idea, how close we have worked with Russia in the past. And the Russians also, what did they learn? They learned that they could do it all, and they don't need to worry about logistics, and they could just get away because they have massive amounts of people and weapons. Well, we can afford, 20-to-1 losses against the Ukrainians. Well, that didn't work out. They don't have, like you mentioned earlier, all the people that they can sacrifice and that. And guess what? Their people don't want to sacrifice, because on their phones, they can see what's going on in the West. They can see how people are living, and they want to get out. The number of the tens of thousands of people who crossed the border into Belarus, in the Baltic states, into Finland, into Georgia, into Kazakhstan, and elsewhere out of Russia did so. They were voting with their feet because they have no way to vote in Russia to change things. So the Russian army, who did they fight? You mentioned Afghanistan. Well, what other war did they fight? They crushed the Czechoslovak, rebellion. They crushed civilians. They crushed Hungary in '56. That was against civilians. They crushed Syria against them. They crushed Georgia. Where have they fought as an army against a real first-class army since World War II? And the answer is nowhere. until they got into Ukraine. And guess what happened? It all fell apart.
Well, Dana, we also suffer from a bit of the same blindsidedness. Everyone forgets that on D-Day, Rome had fallen the day before. We had liberated Rome.
Yes.
And when we landed in Normandy, the Russians had expelled the Germans from almost all of their own territory and were getting ready to liberate Eastern Europe.
Yes.
And then again, I'm 73 Arab-Israeli war. The Americans are negotiating with the Russians, with the Egyptians and the Israelis to get a ceasefire so they could all be home by Christmas. And I'm thinking, well, this is great. We have Jews fighting Muslims. Why would they want to be home by Christmas? And then then in Iraq, we bring democracy to people who can't even spell it.
Right. Yes.
So, yeah, it's now in my trip to China, I forgot what year that was in. We went to the AVG Museum in Kunming, and they did acknowledge the American help. Quite a turnaround. And in my 2005 trip to Russia, I did get some sense that they were making some acknowledgement of our friendly aid to them. So, yeah, but again, we each side has its own parochial views,
Right.
and the uprisings like Hungary and Czechoslovakia, it's what I call the Stalin doctrine of keeping a buffer state between homeland Russia and the West or other countries.
Mhm.
Thanks, Steve. We got a couple more minutes, maybe one or two more questions or
I've
comments.
spoken enough.
Yeah.
Well, I see somebody listening in here that is an acknowledged expert on what we've been talking about. Hey, Jim, do you want to say anything? You need to unmute yourself. You need to
Not yet, James. Not yet, Jim. You're still on mute. I think
Check
I
the
can.
box.
I can
Check-
unmute him. I think. Let me give it a try here.
Check the bottom of your screen. You might see it there.
Unmute. Okay, that did it.
There we go.
Yep.
That did it.
Yeah, it popped up. Okay, you did it. Thank you. Yeah, no, I think those are certainly some valid points that you are making right after the First World War. In fact, during the First World War, the Ukraine actually tried to separate themselves from Russia. They had been very closely connected with Russia since the 1660s, when an agreement was made during the wars between Poland, the Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Russia, and Ukraine was looking for allies. In some ways, I like to say the Ukrainians are a lot like the Indians, the American Indians. You know, the Indians in the French and Indian War, they allied themselves with the French. The British won. In the American Revolutionary War, they got smarter and said, well, we'll go with the bigger power this time. They allied themselves with the British, and we won. In the War of 1812, they thought, well, maybe we can make the difference in power. They allied themselves again with the British. And of course, in the Civil War, they principally allied themselves with the South. So, you know, they just couldn't win for losing. The Ukrainians, unfortunately, picked the wrong side in the 1660s. That was Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who was a headman, a Zaporovian headman, which, you know, should ring true to today. And what we see in the during the First World War, when they separated themselves, and shortly thereafter, Poland won its war with the Soviet Union. Poland was an independent nation in 1922. So in this Ukrainian-Russian war, which is a little more complicated than I think what we generally look at in history, we see it as a war between the Reds and the Whites. The imperial forces, the Whites, were trying to defend small enclaves in various places throughout Russia to preserve these little pieces of the empire and bring back the Romanovs. The Blacks were separate. Now, these were really more Asiatic Russians who were looking to separate themselves from the White Russians. They weren't sure they wanted the Romanovs back, but they certainly did not like the Bolshevik government. They had, the Mensheviks, they might have made some sort of deal with, but they weren't going to do things with that. So then we have the Ukraine in this war that's going on between Poland, between the Reds, the Whites, and the Blacks. They don't pick any allies. I'm not quite sure why. It may be that they didn't think anyone had their interest at heart or that anybody else was going to win. So they went alone. They did it alone, and it didn't work. They couldn't do it. Had they allied themselves with the Poles, that may have worked better. And of course, there's a Polish history with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth where they lost against them. And that war, back in the 1700s, they should have allied themselves with the Swedes so that they had Poland and Lithuania hemmed in from the other side. They didn't do it there. So that's my Indian analogy. They keep picking the wrong sets of allies. I think they've done a little better this time. I'm in the midst of an article, and I've written the first 2/3 of it, where I'm looking at the battle space in politics and diplomacy, where perhaps the Ukrainians allied to us need to look at what we can do differently with the UN, where the Russians are very powerful. They have a veto. The Soviet Union was a signatory in the original UN Charter. We give Russia now the place of the Soviet Union. They are not signatories to the Charter. So they are acting as a derivative state. So we can't get a security declaration against their current actions because they would veto it, which puts Ukraine at a disadvantage. As allies, we have been stalwart, we have been resilient, but oh my God, have we been predictable. We have done all the things that Putin would expect. He's an incrementalist. Let's take a little bit of Georgia. Let's take a little bit of Azerbaijan. Let's contribute to what's going on in Kazakhstan and see if we can get that back, or at least keep them in our orbit. For various reasons, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan have fallen out of that orbit a bit, but they are still the problem. Nazarbayev, until he went under 2 years ago in Kazakhstan. But we need to look at things that we can do to make a difference, to make the conversation about us rather than about him, and stop the incrementalism. I'd like to see NATO, for example, immediately invite Ukraine to join, and let's put NATO troops in Western Ukraine. Let's not confront Russia directly, but let's put them in the West and say, this is where we make our stand. We won't let you go beyond here, and this needs to stop. And we're strong enough that we can express our intentions of what we want to do and make the conversation about us rather than about Putin. And of course, this morning, we've had this wonderful explosion of the bridge at the mouth of the Sea of Azov, which once again, it demonstrates tactical prowess on the part of the Ukrainians and consistent with what they've done over the last 100 years. But we need to take strategic advantage of that. I'll quit at that point.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. A lot to consider for sure. So we're at the end of the meeting time. Dana, any final comment that you wanted to make before we close out?
I just want to remind everybody that if you want me to share the YouTube channels that have a lot of the information that I have been sharing with you from former military, retired military, and independent groups doing things in Ukraine and around the world, I'm happy to do that. You can send me a note to dana.lombardi@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to share those with you. And you can be listening to the same stuff I'm listening to. Thank you.
Thanks, Dana. I put your email in the chat again, along with the association website. So I think we are back. We're back in November. That is going to be November 12th. Steve, I believe you're going to be up on November 12th. So we'll have an announcement coming out about that in late October to give you a heads up about what we're talking about. And just a reminder, it's coming toward the end of the member year. So if you'd like to renew your dues, we'd like you to renew them. Make sure that you could get we just mailed the fall issue 17 of World War I Illustrated. That should be in your mailbox if you're a current dues paying member, or in your inbox if you get the PDF subscription. if you're not sure about your membership, just contact me. I'm going to put my email here. And Sal, did you have anything that you wanted to add before we close? Sal, I think you are muted.
I just want to mention, I want to thank Dana for doing a marvelous job. Wonderful way of explaining what's going on. But if you might be willing to understand this too, that both Alberta and Manitoba in Canada has enormous Ukrainian residents there. And many of their young men have been volunteering, going to Ukraine to fight, because that's part of their heritage. I didn't know whether many of you knew that, but Canada has an enormous Ukrainian immigration to that country. And last, I want to let everybody know that we have speakers from now to the end of January, but I'm looking for speakers next year on any topic. Now you can contact Melanie or me or anyone else. She has the email, my email. She'll tell you if anybody wants to give any talk on anything about World War I and its after effects, as Dana has done. Please let me know. That's all. Thank you very much. A great program.
Yeah, thanks, Sal. Thank you, Dana. Dana filled in really at the very last minute. So appreciate that, Dana. I know these are a lot of work. I know firsthand how much work these are, so appreciate all the last minute efforts.
Thanks a lot, Dana.
Bye,
All right, well,
everybody.
thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Dana. Thanks, Sal. Thanks, everyone, for all your comments. This will be up on the website, or sorry, on the YouTube channel early next week, and we'll see you in November. Thank
Yep.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.